They say the truth has a way of rising to the surface, like a bubble of air trapped under ice. But for years, in our house, the ice was so thick I thought I'd never breathe again. My name is Elena, and I grew up in a world of polished mahogany, silent hallways, and the heavy scent of my father's expensive cigars. We were the Sterlings, a name that carried weight in this city, a name that stood for integrity. Or so I thought. My mother passed away when I was barely 7. My memories of her are like faded Polaroids, soft edges, a specific floral perfume, and a laugh that sounded like wind chimes. After she left, the silence in our mansion became a permanent resident. My father, Arthur, buried himself in his work, building an empire while I grew up in the shadows of a house that felt too big for 2 people. Then came Julianne. I was 24 when she appeared. I remember the day vividly. It was raining. One of those gray, oppressive afternoons where the sky feels like it's falling. My father called me into the study. He looked younger than he had in years. His eyes, usually sharp and calculating, were soft. He was holding the hand of a woman who looked like she had stepped out of a vintage film. She was elegant, with pale skin and eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 secrets. "Elena," he said, his voice trembling with a strange kind of joy. "I want you to meet someone. This is Julianne. She's the daughter of a very old friend. She's had a difficult time and she'll be staying with us." At first, I wanted to be kind. I knew how lonely this house could be. But from the moment Julianne stepped over the threshold, something felt wrong. It wasn't anything she said, it was the way she looked at the paintings on the wall, not with admiration, but with a sense of calculation. She moved through our home not as a guest, but as a predator staking out new territory. Weeks turned into months. Julianne became a fixture. She was helpful, charming, and endlessly patient with my father. She learned his coffee preferences, the exact way he liked his newspapers folded, and the stories of his childhood. But when his back was turned, the mask slipped. I would catch her staring at me in the hallways, a cold, hollow gaze that made the hair on my arms stand up. "You don't belong here, Elena," she whispered to me one night by the stairs. I had caught her going through my mother's jewelry box. "Excuse me?" I stammered, my heart racing. "This house," she said, trailing a finger over a pearl necklace, "that belonged to my mother. It's too much for a girl like you. You don't appreciate the weight of it." "I do." I tried to tell my father. I tried to explain that she was looking through mother's things, that she was speaking to me with a venom I couldn't describe, but Arthur was blinded. To him, Julianne was the second chance at a family he thought he'd lost. He started pulling away from me, listening to her subtle whispers. She told him I was unstable, that I was resentful of his happiness. Slowly, I became a stranger in my own home. Julianne convinced him to change his will. She convinced him that I needed guidance, which translated to her having control over my inheritance. The betrayal didn't happen in one day. It was a slow erosion. Every meal was a performance of her perfection and my supposed failures. I felt shattered watching my father, the man who taught me to be strong, become a puppet in her manicured hands. But the mystery deepened when I found a letter hidden in the library. It was an old yellowed envelope addressed to my father from a woman named Sarah, the old friend he had mentioned. The letter spoke of a daughter. Yes, but the dates didn't match. The girl mentioned in the letter would have been 10 years older than Julianne. I realized then that we weren't just dealing with a gold digger, we were dealing with a ghost. A shadow who had stolen a dead woman's identity to swallow our lives whole. The atmosphere in the Sterling estate turned from cold to suffocating. My father's health began to decline rapidly. He was tired, confused, and increasingly dependent on the medicine Julianne prepared for him every night. Whenever I tried to step in, she was there, a graceful barrier between me and my father. "He needs rest, Elena," she would say, her voice like silk over a blade. "You only agitate him with your accusations." I felt my world breaking. I spent my nights in the local archives and online, desperately trying to trace the real Julianne. I discovered that the real daughter of Sarah had died in a car accident in a small town 3 years ago. The woman in our house was a phantom. She had studied our family, learned our history, and swooped in when my father was at his most vulnerable. I'll never forget the night I confronted her in the kitchen. The house was silent, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock. "I know who you are," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "I know the real Julianne is dead." She didn't flinch. She didn't even stop pouring her tea. She just turned, a slow, terrifying smile spreading across her face. "And who is going to believe you, Elena? To the world, I am the grieving ward. To your father, I'm his angel. And you? You're just the bitter daughter who can't handle sharing her daddy's checkbook. She stepped closer, the moonlight hitting her eyes. If you try to stop this, I will make sure you leave this house with nothing. No name, no money, and no father. I've already convinced him you're stealing from the estate. One more word, and I call the police. I was destroyed. I retreated to my room sobbing. My own father believed a stranger over me. He had signed papers he hadn't read. He had looked at me with disappointment that cut deeper than any knife. I felt like a ghost in my own life, watching this woman erase my mother's memory and my father's legacy. But in the depth of that pain, something shifted. The shattered pieces of my heart started to sharpen. If I couldn't win with emotion, I would win with cold, hard truth. I began to play her game. I apologized to her. I pretended to be the unstable daughter she wanted. I let her think she had won. While she was busy planning a restructuring of my father's assets, I was working with a private investigator and an old family lawyer who Julianne had forced into retirement. We went deep. We found her real name, Clara, a woman with a history of caring for wealthy, elderly men who passed away shortly after changing their wills. The betrayal wasn't just against me, it was against the very soul of my family. I watched her sit at my mother's piano, playing songs she hadn't earned the right to play. I watched her wear my mother's rings. It fueled a fire in me that replaced the sadness. I wasn't just going to kick her out, I was going to expose her in the most public, undeniable way possible. The climax was set for the probate court hearing. Julianne had moved to have my father declared partially incompetent to grant her full power of attorney. She thought it was her coronation day. She arrived in a black dress looking like a tragic devoted saint. As we sat in that sterile, high-ceilinged courtroom, I looked at my father. He looked frail, his eyes wandering. Julianne held his hand, whispering lies into his ear. She thought she had reached the finish line. She didn't know I had spent the last 48 hours showing my father the evidence in his few moments of clarity. The death certificate of the real Julianne, the photos of Clara's previous clients. At first, he hadn't believed me. He had screamed at me to leave. But then, I showed him the one thing Julianne couldn't faking. A letter my mother had written to the real Sarah, describing a birthmark the real daughter had. A birthmark our Julianne didn't possess. The courtroom was heavy with the smell of old paper and floor wax. The judge leaned forward, looking over his spectacles at the documents Julianne's lawyer had presented. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said, his voice echoing, "do you understand the implications of granting this power of attorney to Julianne? You are effectively handing over the management of your entire estate." Julianne squeezed my father's hand. "He understands, Your Honor," she said softly. "He just wants peace." "I asked the witness, not you," the judge snapped. My father stood up slowly. He looked smaller than usual, his hands trembling. For a moment, I feared the medicine had clouded his mind too much. I feared she had won. He looked at Julianne, then at me. I sat in the front row, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Then, the air in the room seemed to vanish. "She's an imposter," my father shouted. His voice wasn't the weak, frail sound of a sick man. It was the roar of the Arthur Sterling I remembered. It was the sound of a man who had finally woken up from a nightmare. "She's an imposter." He what? Repeated, pointing a shaking finger at the woman beside him. "This woman is not who she says she is. She has poisoned my home, she has poisoned my mind, and she has tried to steal my daughter's birthright." The courtroom went silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the marble floor. Julianne's face went from a mask of devotion to a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. She tried to grab his arm, to pull him down, to whisper another lie, but he pushed her away with a strength that shocked everyone. "Your Honor," our family lawyer stood up, producing a thick file. "We have the DNA results from a hairbrush found in the guest suite, compared against the records of the late Sarah's family. We also have the criminal record of one Clara Jenkins." It was over in a matter of minutes, though it felt like hours. The police, who I had arranged to be present, stepped forward. Julianne, Clara, tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. She was trapped by the truth she thought she had buried. As they led her out in handcuffs, she didn't look like a cinematic star anymore. She looked small, bitter, and defeated. She looked at me one last time as she was escorted past my seat. "I almost had it all," she hissed. "You had nothing," I replied, quietly, "because everything in that house was built on love and you don't even know what that word means. The aftermath was a long road. My father's health improved once the medicine she was giving him was out of his system. We had to spend months untangling the legal mess she had created, but for the first time in years, the house felt light. We sold the mansion, it held too many shadows, and moved to a smaller place by the coast. I learned that justice isn't always a fast-moving river. Sometimes it's a slow drip that eventually breaks the stone. I watched my father rediscover his laugh, and I rediscovered the man who had raised me. We don't talk about Julianne much anymore. She is a closed chapter in a very long book, but sometimes when I'm sitting on the porch watching the sunset, I think about that moment in the court. I think about the power of a single truth to shatter 1,000 lies. I was broken, yes. I was betrayed by the person I trusted most, but in that wreckage I found a strength I didn't know I possessed. I learned that a legacy isn't about money or mahogany furniture. It's about the truth you carry in your heart and the people you refuse to give up on. My father and I are whole again, and in the end, that is the best revenge I could ever ask for. Peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's the presence of justice. And finally, for the Sterlings, the silence is no longer heavy. It's beautiful.